Welcome to this deep dive into the neuroscience of creative thinking. Today we're going to explore the scientific principles behind unconventional methods like random prompts, morphological matrices, and forced analogies, and understand how they work in the brain to push thinking beyond habitual patterns. Let's start with a fundamental question. Why do we need these unconventional methods in the first place? The answer lies in how our brains are wired for efficiency. Your brain represents only about 2% of your body mass, yet it consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy. This is an enormous metabolic cost. The average human brain weighs about 1.4 kilograms, while the average body weighs 70 kilograms. That's 1.4 divided by 70, which equals 0.02 or 2% of total body mass. Your brain continuously consumes about 20 watts of power. That's equivalent to a dim light bulb running 24 hours a day. 20 watts times 24 hours equals 480 watt-hours per day. That's roughly 400 to 500 calories just for your brain. Because of this high energy cost, evolution has optimized our brains to form efficient neural pathways. Let me explain what happens at the cellular level. When two neurons fire together repeatedly, the synapse between them strengthens. This is called Hebbian learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. When you repeat a thought pattern or action, your brain wraps myelin, a fatty insulating substance, around the axons of those neural pathways. This increases signal transmission speed by up to 100 times. Unmyelinated axons conduct signals at about 0.5 to 2 meters per second, while heavily myelinated axons can reach 120 meters per second. Over time, these strengthened pathways become your default mode. Your brain preferentially routes thoughts through these well-worn neural highways because they're energy efficient. Here's where it gets interesting. Neuroscientists have identified a specific brain network called the default mode network, or DMN, that activates when you're not focused on external tasks. The DMN includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus. These regions show coordinated activity when you're daydreaming, reminiscing, or thinking about yours. So here's an important question. What's the problem with the default mode network? Why would we want to disrupt it? The answer is that the DMN tends to reinforce your existing mental models and beliefs. It keeps you in familiar cognitive territory. This is great for routine tasks, but terrible for creative problem solving. Research by Roger Beatty and colleagues has shown that high DMN activity is inversely correlated with divergent thinking tasks. The more your default network dominates, the less creative your solutions tend to be. Now let's examine our first unconventional method, random prompts. How does introducing randomness help the brain break free from habitual patterns? When you encounter a random word or concept that's unrelated to your problem, your brain must activate neural pathways that weren't part of your default problem-solving network. Imagine you're trying to design a better bicycle, and you're given the random prompt, octopus. Your brain must now create a connection between bicycles and octopuses. This forces activation of neural networks that would never naturally connect. The mechanism involves your prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for cognitive control and working memory. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can maintain multiple unrelated concepts in working memory simultaneously. This creates what's called conceptual blending. George Miller famously proposed that working memory can hold about 7 plus or minus 2 items. More recent research suggests it's closer to 4 chunks of information. Here's the catch. Forming new neural connections requires significantly more energy than using existing pathways. Making a new synapse costs roughly 100,000 ATP molecules. That's 10 to the power of 5 ATP molecules per new synaptic connection. Your brain resists this naturally, which is why random prompts feel uncomfortable at first. Let's move to our second method, morphological analysis, also known as morphological matrices. This was developed by Fritz Zwicky, an astrophysicist in the 1940s. Morphological analysis works by breaking a problem into independent dimensions or attributes, then systematically combining different values for each dimension. For example, designing a personal vehicle. You might have dimensions like transport method, power source, and control mechanism. Each dimension has multiple options. With 3 options for each of 3 dimensions, you get 3 times 3 times 3 equals 27 possible combinations. Many will be familiar, but some will be completely novel. Neurologically, this method activates what's called combinatorial coding in the temporal and parietal cortices. Different feature detectors fire simultaneously to represent combined concepts. Here's another important question. Why does systematic combination generate more creative ideas than free association? The answer lies in how it constrains the search space. Completely free association can lead to random, unproductive tangents. Morphological analysis provides just enough structure to guide exploration while forcing unusual combinations. Research by Patricia Stokes has demonstrated that constraints, paradoxically, enhance creativity. They prevent the brain from falling back into the most obvious, well-worn solutions. Let's do a back-of-the-envelope calculation to understand the magnitude of unexplored idea space. If you have 5 dimensions with 4 options each, that's 4 to the power of 5, which equals 1024 possible combinations. In typical habitual thinking, you might only explore about 10 of the most obvious combinations. That means you're ignoring over 1,000 potential solutions. 10 divided by 1024 is approximately 1%. You're only exploring 1% of the available solution space with habitual thinking. Now let's examine forced analogies, which leverage one of the brain's most powerful capabilities, cross-domain mapping. Analogical reasoning involves mapping the relational structure from one domain, the source, to another domain, the target. This activates the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex. Consider the gecko foot problem. Engineers asked, how does nature solve adhesion? They mapped the solution structure from gecko feet to create improved adhesive tape using van der Waals forces. To understand why forced analogies work, we need to understand semantic networks in the brain. According to semantic network theory, concepts are stored as nodes in a vast associative network. Related concepts have stronger connections, measured by synaptic weights. The connection strength from node I to node J, denoted as W sub ij, determines how easily activation spreads from one concept to another. When you think of a concept, activation spreads through the network like ripples in a pond. Close concepts receive more activation, distant concepts receive less. The activation of node J at time t plus 1 equals the sum over all I of W sub ij times the activation of node I at time t. This is spreading activation. Forced analogies work by deliberately bridging distant regions of the semantic network that wouldn't naturally connect. This creates what researchers call remote associations. Psychologists use the remote associates test to measure creative thinking. You're given 3 words and must find a 4th that connects them all. For example, cottage, Swiss, cake. What word connects all 3? The answer is cheese. Cottage cheese, Swiss cheese, cheesecake. Brain imaging studies by Mark Jung Beeman show that creative individuals can access remote associations more quickly. Their semantic networks have more long-range connections. Let's talk about the neurochemistry of creative thinking. Specific neurotransmitters play crucial roles in enabling these unconventional thinking methods. Dopamine, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, is essential for cognitive flexibility. It allows you to switch between different mental representations. Optimal dopamine concentration in the prefrontal cortex is around 10 to the negative 6 to 10 to the negative 7 molar. Too much or too little impairs creative thinking. Norepinephrine modulates the signal-to-noise ratio in neural circuits. Moderate levels allow weak, unusual associations to reach consciousness. GABA, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter, controls how much filtering occurs. Reduced GABA inhibition in creative states allows more ideas through, even unusual ones. Here's a fascinating phenomenon. Solutions often emerge after you stop actively working on a problem. This is called the incubation effect. During sleep and mind wandering, your brain continues processing. The hippocampus replays experiences, and weak associations get strengthened through a process called memory consolidation. Sleep spindles, oscillations at 12 to 16 Hz, facilitate communication between the hippocampus and cortex. This helps reorganize semantic networks. Here's an intriguing question. Can we calculate the probability of having a creative insight? The answer is we can create a rough Bayesian approximation. The probability depends on the number of concepts you're holding in working memory and their associative distances. Probability of insight is proportional to n times d times t, where N is the number of concepts, D is their average distance in the semantic network, and T is time spent in a relaxed state. If you hold 4 concepts with average distance 5 and spend 30 minutes, rough estimates suggest a probability around 0.6 or 60% for at least one novel connection. Let's work through a practical example using all 3 methods to design something novel. Let's design a new type of educational tool. First, random prompt. Hurricane. How does a hurricane relate to education? Hurricanes have spiral structure. They gather and concentrate energy. They have a calm center. Second, create a matrix. Dimensions. Information delivery, student engagement, feedback mechanism. Options. Spiral curriculum, energy gathering discussions, calm reflection periods. Here's our matrix. We can combine spiral delivery with energy-building engagement and calm center feedback. This gives us a novel concept. Third, forced analogy with the eye of the storm. The eye is calm, but surrounded by intense activity. Maybe students need intense active learning periods followed by calm reflection time where insights can crystallize. The result, a spiral learning system with alternating intensity and calm cycles. Students revisit concepts with increasing complexity while experiencing structured intensity followed by reflection. Let's quantify the creative output from these methods with some rough estimates. In normal habitual thinking, you might generate 2 to 3 viable ideas per hour of focused work. Using unconventional methods, research suggests you can increase this to 8 to 12 viable ideas per hour. That's a 4-fold increase in creative productivity. Moreover, independent judges rate the novelty of these ideas 2 to 3 times higher on average, so you're not just generating more ideas, but more novel ones. The good news is that your brain can be trained to use these methods more efficiently through neuroplasticity. Regular practice with unconventional methods strengthens alternative neural pathways. After about 8 weeks of consistent practice, brain imaging shows structural changes in the prefrontal cortex. If you practice 20 minutes per day for 56 days, that's about 18 to 19 hours of total practice. This appears to be sufficient for measurable cognitive changes. Studies show gray matter volume increases in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. These regions become better at cognitive control and conflict monitoring. Let's do a final cost-benefit analysis of using these methods from a pure energy perspective. Creating new neural pathways costs roughly 30% more energy than using existing ones in the short term. However, these methods can reduce time to find a good solution by about 50% for novel problems. And solution quality, measured by expert ratings and practical outcomes, increases by approximately 60%. The net benefit is negative 0.3 plus 0.5 plus 0.6, giving us about 0.8 or an 80% improvement in overall creative problem-solving efficiency. However, we must acknowledge the limitations. These methods don't work equally well for all problem types. They work best for ill-defined, open-ended problems where multiple solutions exist. They are less effective for well-defined technical problems with single optimal solutions. You need sufficient domain knowledge first. Random connections only work if you have a rich semantic network to draw from. Novices may generate nonsensical combinations. Individual differences matter. People with higher working memory capacity and cognitive flexibility benefit more. Baseline differences can account for 40% of variance in outcomes. Let me summarize the key scientific principles we've covered. First, the brain naturally optimizes for energy efficiency by creating strong habitual neural pathways. This saves energy but limits creative thinking. Second, random prompts work by forcing activation of neural pathways that wouldn't naturally connect, engaging prefrontal cognitive control systems. Third, morphological analysis provides systematic exploration of the solution space, dramatically increasing coverage from 1% to potentially 80 or 90%. Fourth, forced analogies leverage the brain's powerful relational mapping capabilities, activating the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex to bridge distant semantic regions. Fifth, optimal dopamine and norepinephrine levels, combined with reduced GABA inhibition, create the neurochemical environment necessary for cognitive flexibility. And sixth, neuroplasticity allows these unconventional thinking methods to become more efficient with practice, creating structural brain changes over 8 weeks. The paradox of creative thinking is that calculated randomness is more effective than pure randomness or pure structure alone. The sweet spot is constrained exploration of novel conceptual space. You need enough structure to guide your search, but enough randomness to escape habitual patterns. With practice, what initially feels forced and uncomfortable becomes more natural as your brain builds new pathways and your semantic networks develop more long-range connections. The metabolic and cognitive investment in these methods pays substantial dividends in creative problem-solving power, particularly for complex, open-ended challenges.